Hey everyone, today I'm going to tell you a story, and it's not just any story, it's perhaps the most famous story in all of philosophy. It's a story about how democracy died, not with a bang, but with 1,000 small compromises. It's about what happens when a society becomes so afraid of questions that it puts wisdom itself on trial. You might know the story of Socrates, the philosopher who was forced to drink hemlock, but what you might not know is just how deeply this single death echoes through history, and how frighteningly relevant it remains today. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why this one execution in ancient Athens still haunts us 2,400 years later. So grab a drink, maybe not hemlock, get comfortable, and let me tell you about the day philosophy was put on trial. Picture Athens in the twilight years of its golden age. The city is nursing its wounds from a devastating military defeat by Sparta. Its democracy is fragile and paranoid, and its citizens are desperately searching for someone to blame. Through the crowded streets walks a barefoot figure, weather-beaten and ugly, with a peculiar habit of stopping young men to ask them seemingly simple questions that leave them re-evaluating everything they thought they knew. "I know that I know nothing," he famously declared, yet this profession of ignorance would prove more threatening to the Athenian establishment than any claim to wisdom. For in a society built on unquestionable traditions and convenient certainties, a man who exposes the ignorance of others while claiming none of the usual religious authority is more dangerous than any foreign army. The official charges against Socrates read like a hit list of authoritarian anxieties. Corrupting the youth, introducing new gods, and not believing in the gods of the state. It's rather telling that atheism, in a society that regularly introduced new cults and deities, suddenly became a capital crime when wielded against someone who questioned the moral foundations of power. But here's the reality. The man charged with impiety was, by all accounts, rather traditionally religious. He spoke of his personal daimon, a sort of divine inner voice, and regularly performed the expected religious rituals. The real issue wasn't his lack of belief, but rather his persistent questioning on whether the gods could possibly be as petty and immoral as the popular stories portrayed them. As we delve deeper into this story, we'll see how the trial of Socrates was about power, about the fear of questioning, and about a society's desperate attempt to silence the voice that kept asking, "Are you sure about that?" For now, let's wind back the clock to explore the Athens that shaped Socrates, and how a stonemason's son became the gadfly of a democracy. Athens, 469 BCE. A child is born to a stonemason and a midwife in the shadow of the Acropolis. His name is Socrates, and if you'd told anyone at the time that this working-class infant would become the foundation of Western philosophy, they'd have laughed you out of the agora. But then again, Athens itself was in the midst of its own unlikely transformation. The city Socrates was born into was experiencing what historians would later call the classical age, though of course no one living through a golden age quite realizes it at the time. The Persian threat had been beaten back at Marathon and Salamis, and Athens was riding on a wave of military success and cultural confidence. Democracy, that grand experiment in collective governance, was hitting its stride. The Parthenon would soon rise above the city, a testament to Athenian ambition, carved in marble and gold. But beneath this glittering surface, tensions were brewing. Athens' democracy was increasingly turning imperial, treating its allies more like subjects. The old aristocratic families watched their traditional power erode while still maintaining their cultural influence. And religion, that great pillar of Athenian society, was beginning to face uncomfortable questions from a new intellectual movement, the Sophists. Young Socrates grew up learning his father's trade while watching the daily spectacle of democracy in action. Picture him as a young man, covered in stone dust, perhaps pausing in his work to listen to the debates in the agora. The same hands that carved marble would later carve away at the pretensions of Athens' greatest minds, though with considerably less gentleness. What's fascinating about Socrates' early years is how thoroughly ordinary they were. He served as a hoplite in the Athenian army, fighting with distinction at Potidaea, Delium, and Amphipolis. His fellow soldiers noted his peculiar habit of standing motionless for hours, lost in thought, a trait that would later become legendary. Here was a man that could freeze in place on campaign, seemingly impervious to cold, fatigue, or enemy threats, all because he was wrestling with some philosophical problem. But the real turning point came when Socrates encountered the words of Anaxagoras, a philosopher who had been run out of Athens for suggesting that the sun was not a god, but a burning rock. This notion that the world might be explained through natural reasons rather than mythology struck a chord in Socrates' mind that would resonate throughout his life. The young stonemason began to develop his own unique methods of inquiry. Unlike the sophists who taught rhetoric for a fee, Socrates insisted on conducting his philosophical investigations for free, in public, turning the streets of Athens into his classroom. His approach was deceptively simple: ask questions, expose contradictions, repeat until either wisdom or irritation emerged. This was the period when Athens needed critical reflection more than ever. The city was drunk on its own success, expanding its empire, picking fights with rivals, and gradually abandoning the democratic principles it claimed to champion. But instead of a stern prophet crying doom in the wilderness, Athens got something far more unsettling: a squat, ugly man with a habit of asking uncomfortable questions. "What is justice?" he asked the politicians who walked through the agora. "What is courage?" he inquired of the generals. "What is piety?" he would pose to the priests. And when they answered, confident in their expertise, he would begin his gentle, relentless questioning, exposing the contradictions in their thoughts until they were forced to confront their own ignorance. This method, which we now call Socratic irony, earned him admirers and indeed enemies in equal measure. The young aristocrats of Athens found it entertaining when Socrates skewed their elders in public debates, but they were considerably less amused when he turned his questioning on them. Perhaps Socrates would appreciate the irony. Athens' greatest philosopher, the man who would define Western intellectual tradition, emerged not from elite academies or wealthy families, but from the dusty workshop of a stonemason. There's something fitting about that. Both stonework and philosophy require the same essential skill, at least in a sense: the ability to chip away at the excess until you reveal the truth hiding underneath. As we'll see, this period of intellectual ferment would soon come to a crashing halt. The looming disaster of the Peloponnesian War would transform Athens, turning it into a wounded, suspicious society looking for scapegoats. And there, still asking his inconvenient questions in the agora, they would find one. The year is 431 BCE, and Athens is about to learn a harsh lesson about hubris. As Socrates walks through the busy streets of his city, now in his late 30s, the drums of war are beating. The Peloponnesian War is about to begin, a conflict that would last 27 years and transform not just Athens, but the very nature of Greek civilization. Picture Athens at its height, protected by its mighty walls and powerful navy, confident in its democratic institutions and cultural superiority. The Parthenon stands gleaming above the city, newly completed, a testament to Athenian wealth and ambition. In the agora, Socrates continues his philosophical discussions, but now the conversations increasingly turn to questions of justice, power, and the nature of democracy itself. When the war begins, the Athenian strategy seems sound enough: abandon the countryside to the Spartan army, retreat behind the city walls, and rely on naval supremacy to maintain food supplies and trade. It's a rational plan, crafted by rational men, but they hadn't countered an invisible enemy that would prove far more deadlier than any Spartan warrior. In the second year of the war, plague strikes the overcrowded city. Bodies pile up in the streets. Even the great statesman Pericles, architect of Athenian democracy's golden age, succumbs to the disease. In the midst of this chaos, witnesses report seeing Socrates as one of the few who kept his composure, tending to the sick despite the risk, continuing his philosophical discussion even as death stalks the streets. But the plague does more than kill Athenian citizens. It begins to kill faith in the democratic system itself. As the death toll mounts, traditional religious explanations fail to satisfy. The gods seem either absent or hostile. The comfortable certainties of Athenian society begin to crack under the strain. Into this vacuum of authority steps new leaders, men whom Socrates would later criticize as demagogues, popular politicians who promise easy answers to complex questions. The war drags on, and year after bloody year, Athens begins to change. The state that had prided itself on its openness and rationality grows increasingly paranoid and authoritarian. 16 years into the war, on the eve of the disastrous Sicilian expedition, Athens erupts in religious panic. Someone mutilates the Hermia, sacred religious markers throughout the city. The response is swift and brutal. Accusations of sacrilege and impiety fly. Citizens are executed based on questionable evidence. Among those accused is Alcibiades, Socrates' former student and the expedition's leader, who flees to Sparta rather than face trial. The Sicilian expedition proves to be an utter catastrophe. A great many of Athenian youth dies on foreign shores. The navy, the source of Athens' power, is destroyed. And back home, democracy itself begins to die inch by inch. Just 4 years on, a group of oligarchs overthrow the democracy, establishing the rule of the 400. Though this regime lasts only months and democracy was briefly restored, it was followed in 404 BCE by an even more brutal oligarchy, one that would become known as the 30 Tyrants, led by another of Socrates' former students. For 8 months, the 30 wage a campaign of terror against their fellow citizens. They execute hundreds of Athenians and force thousands more into exile. Through all this, Socrates remains in the city, continuing his philosophical investigations. When the 30 try to implicate him in their crimes by ordering him to arrest an innocent man, he simply goes home instead, risking death through passive resistance. Eventually, democracy would be restored once again, but it's wounded and wary, searching for explanations for its near total collapse. As so often happens in history, people begin looking for someone to blame, and they find a convenient target in the figure of that persistent questioner who had walked among them for decades, asking his uncomfortable questions about justice, wisdom, and the gods. Named after the goddess of wisdom, Athens, a city born in rational discourse, reborn in blood, now prepared to put rationality on trial itself. The hemlock is already growing somewhere in the Greek countryside, waiting to play its part in this drama. But before we get to that bitter end, we need to understand the bitter men who would bring the charges. These are the men who decided to put philosophy on trial. First up is Meletus, a young tragic poet of mediocre talent and immense ambition. He's young, earnest, probably sporting the kind of neatly trimmed beard that screams, "Take me seriously." The sort of person who would write angsty poetry about the decay of traditional values while conveniently forgetting his own father's collaboration with the 30 Tyrants. Meletus would be the primary prosecutor, though evidence suggests he was merely the frontman for more powerful interests. Then we have Lycon, a professional orator representing the political class. Think of him as the establishment's attack dog, the kind of man who makes his living by knowing which way the political winds are blowing. He's the sort that would probably begin each speech with, "as a concerned citizen," while carefully omitting his own questionable activities during the recent coup. Finally, there's Anytus. Now, here's the real driving force. A wealthy leviturner turned democratic politician, Anytus had thought against the 30 Tyrants and had helped restore democracy to Athens. He was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of successful businessman turned politician that Socrates loved to intellectually skewer in the marketplace. But Anytus had a more personal grudge. His son had spent time in Socrates' circle, and instead of following his father into the family business, the young man had developed philosophical interests. The former charges they brought against Socrates read like a beginner's list in political manipulation. Socrates does wrong by corrupting the youth and by not believing in the gods in whom the city believes, but rather other new daimonia. It's worth noting the brilliant cynicism of this indictment. If Socrates defended his religious beliefs, he'd have to explain why he asked so many uncomfortable questions about divine nature. If he focused on his teaching, he'd have to explain why so many of his former students had turned against democracy. The accusations are also wonderfully vague. Corrupting the youth. What exactly does that mean? Teaching them to think critically? Encouraging them to question authority? In a democracy still traumatized by civil war, these could easily be painted as dangerous activities. As for New Diamonia, this was a city that regularly imported new gods and cults. The hypocrisy would have been laughable if the stakes weren't so deadly. The timing of the trial was equally calculated. Athens had recently passed an amnesty law forbidding persecution for most actions taken during the reign of the 30 tyrants. This meant that the actual collaborators with the oligarchy, including some of Socrates' accuser's own relatives, were legally untouchable. But Socrates, who had remained in the city and defied the 30, could be persecuted for his teachings before, during, and after the civil war. Consider the revolting irony. A man who had risked his life by refusing to participate in the 30's crimes was now persecuted by men who had either collaborated with or fled from those same tyrants. All in the name of protecting democracy, of course. The trial proceedings were grim. They painted Socrates as a sophisticated intellectual who used clever arguments to undermine traditional values. They reminded the jury of his association with Alcibiades and Critias, carefully omitting his opposition to their actions. They presented him as a dangerous subversive who taught young men to despise democracy by questioning its foundations. But perhaps most cunningly, they portrayed him as a profiteer of subversion. Never mind that Socrates took no payment for his teaching, unlike the sophists. Never mind that he served Athens faithfully as a soldier and a citizen. Never mind his resistance to the 30. Never mind that his questions were aimed at strengthening, not weakening, the moral foundations of society. The prosecution knew their audience, a jury of 500 citizens, many of whom who'd lived through the oligarchical coups, all of whom had been raised on the traditional values that Socrates had been questioning. They didn't need to prove their specific charges, they just needed to paint a picture of a man the jury wanted to convict. Socrates, true to form, did precisely what his accusers hoped he would. He refused to play their game. Instead of offering the expected emotional appeals and political compromises, he chose to do what he had always done. Take exactly the wrong approach for saving his life, and exactly the right approach for immortalizing his principles. Imagine the law courts of Athens packed with hundreds of citizens serving as jury. The morning sun streams through the columns as a 70-year-old man, short, ugly, and remarkably calm, steps forward to defend himself against charges that would cost him his life. If you're expecting a dramatic appeal for mercy, you're about to be sorely disappointed. Socrates begins his defense not with an emotional appeal, but with a joke. "I am quite a stranger to the language of this place," he says to the law court where he's appeared countless times. "I would have you regard me as if I were really a stranger, whom you would excuse if he spoke in his native tongue." It's classic Socrates. He's telling them that while he might be physically in a law court, he'll be speaking the language of philosophy. It's both a warning and a challenge to the judges. You may be trying me according to legal procedures, but I'll be trying you according to the standards of truth. What follows is one of the most remarkable self-defense speeches in history, preserved by Plato in the Apology. Rather than defend himself against the specific charges, Socrates takes his accuser's claims as an opportunity to examine the nature of wisdom, justice, and divine command. He recounts how his friend once asked the oracle of Delphi if anyone was wiser than Socrates. The oracle replied that no one was wiser. Socrates, taking disbelief in his own wisdom, says he took this as a divine puzzle to be solved. He began questioning those who were considered wise, politicians, poets, craftsmen, only to discover that while they claimed knowledge of important things, they actually knew nothing. "I am wiser than this man," Socrates concludes, "for neither of us appear to know anything great and good, but he fancies he knows something, although he knows nothing, whereas I, as I do not know anything, do not fancy I do." It's a breathtaking moment of philosophical jujitsu. He's taken the charge of impiety and flipped it on its head. Far from being irreligious, he's been carrying out a divine mission. His questioning of Athens' leaders wasn't corruption, but a God-given duty to expose their lack of wisdom. Barreling on, instead of trying to appease the jury, Socrates doubles down. "I was attached to this city by the gods," he declares, "as upon a great and noble horse which was somewhat sluggish because of its size and needed to be stirred up." Think about the sheer audacity of this defense. He's essentially telling the jury that not only is he not guilty, but he's been doing them a favour by annoying them all these years. And if they execute him, well, he says, they be the ones to suffer. If you kill a man like me, you will injure yourselves more than you will injure me. When it comes to the charge of corrupting the youth, Socrates is equally vexatious. He challenges Meletus directly. If he really cares about the youth of Athens, why has he never shown any interest in their education before? And who would deliberately corrupt those around them? Isn't it more likely that if any corruption had occurred, it was unintentional, in which case he should be instructed, not punished? When Socrates addresses the unspoken deal hanging in the air, that he might be acquitted if he agrees to stop philosophizing, his response is unequivocal. Men of Athens, I honour and love you, but I shall obey the divine rather than you, and while I have life and strength, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy, for this is the command of the divine, as I would have you know, and I believe that to this day no greater good has ever happened in the state than my service to the divine. This isn't just a defiance, it's a demonstration of his entire philosophical method. He's showing, not telling, the jury what he means by the examined life, by following truth wherever it leads, by refusing to compromise principles for expediency and freedom. The verdict, when it comes, is hardly surprising. Guilty by a margin of about 30 votes out of 500. But it's in the penalty phase that Socrates delivers his final, magnificent provocation. Requests to propose his own punishment as an alternative to death, he suggests free meals at the state's expense, an honour usually reserved for Olympic champions and public benefactors. When the jury reacts with predictable outrage, he finally proposes a small fine, which his friends offer to pay. But by then, the die is cast. The death sentence follows, and with it, Socrates' path to immortality. It's in his last hours that Socrates provides his most powerful lesson about the relationship between philosophy, religion, and the state. But for now, let's appreciate the extraordinary spectacle we've just witnessed. A man choosing to die rather than compromise his commitment to truth. In an age where truth seems increasingly malleable, perhaps that's a lesson we need more than ever. We return to where we began, a prison cell in Athens, 399 BCE. The sun is setting, and a group of men are gathering around their condemned friend. Among them is Plato, trying to burn every detail into his memory. The guards have just brought a cup of hemlock, and Socrates, this man who made philosophy a way of life, is about to demonstrate how philosophy can teach us to die. But there's something odd about the scene. The condemned man is the calmest person in the room. A month has passed since his sentencing. The execution was delayed because of a religious festival, a detail rich with irony given the charges. During this time, Socrates' friends arranged an escape plan. They had money, influence, and connections in other cities. All Socrates had to do was walk out of his unlocked cell and into exile. He refused. When his friend Crito urged him to think of his children, Socrates, as per usual, responded with a question. Would it benefit his children more to have a father who lived by his principles, or one who abandoned them to save himself? When they argued that his death would deprive Athens of its greatest teacher, he pointed out that fleeing would only prove his accusers right about him corrupting the laws. Even in his final hours, Socrates remained committed. Death, he reasoned, must be one of two things. Either a dreamless sleep, in which case, what's to fear, or a chance to converse with the great heroes and thinkers of the past, in which case, what an opportunity. Either way, he argued, it would be irrational to fear it. When the moment comes, Socrates takes the cup with steady hands. The executioner apologizes. He's seen condemned men rage and curse when drinking the poison. Socrates thanks him for his consideration and asks if he can make a religious offering with a few drops. We are permitted to make a libation only, the man replies, but not drink more than the required amount. I understand, Socrates responds, but I may and must pray to the gods that my departure hence be prosperous. This therefore I pray, and so be it. Quite the scene. A man condemned for impiety, using his last moments to make a religious offering. It's a final demonstration of the gap between the real Socrates and the caricature his accusers created. He drinks the hemlock calmly, following the executioner's instructions to walk around until his legs feel heavy. When the numbness begins to climb from his feet towards his heart, he lays down and covers his face. His last words, famously, are "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Do not forget to pay the debt." Even these final words have layers of meaning. Asclepius was the god of healing, and sacrificing a cock to him was traditional after recovering from an illness. Was Socrates suggesting that life itself was a kind of sickness and death the cure? Or was he, even in his last breath, demonstrating his respect for traditional religious observances? The implications of Socrates' execution rippled out across the ancient world. His student Plato, profoundly affected by the spectacle of democracy executing wisdom, would go on to write dialogues that form the foundations of Western philosophy. The image of a philosopher speaking truth to power, choosing death over compromise, would inspire generations of thinkers and martyrs. But perhaps the most bitter irony is what happened to Athens itself. The democracy that killed Socrates for corrupting the youth found itself increasingly irrelevant in the intellectual life of Greece. The city that once prided itself on freedom of speech discovered that killing questioners don't kill questions, it only drives them underground or abroad. The charges of impiety that killed Socrates would echo through history, deployed again and again by authorities threatened by rational inquiry. From Galileo Galilei to Giordano Bruno, from the Scopes trial to the modern Iranian morality police, we see the same pattern, the powerful using religious orthodoxy as a weapon against those who dare to question received wisdom. But we also see Socrates' legacy in every person who chooses truth over comfort, questioning over certainty, principles over convenience. His method of relentless questioning, of examining life rather than merely living it, remains one of humanity's most powerful tools for seeking truth. The hemlock killed Socrates, but it made his questions immortal. And perhaps that's the final lesson of this story. You can silence a voice, but you cannot silence the truth it spoke. Thank you kindly for taking this journey through ancient Athens with me, and an extra special thank you goes out to everyone who supports this channel. You make these stories possible. In times like these, when truth seems increasingly negotiable and questioning authority is becoming ever more dangerous, these pages of history need to be read. Until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking, and remember, they could silence Socrates, but they couldn't silence his questions.